later.
All right. We should be recording now. I hope you you clean up the beginning and end before
Okay.
you air it.
Yeah. So, so yeah. So, um, uh, I'm I'm not. Zach usually does this.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah. But hello, everyone. This is Eddie Chu talking about capital consumption theory, and today we have a guest on our show. This is Brian with Phoenix Congress, and we're going to talk today about Bitcoin and UBI, Bitcoin and UBI a little bit. Um,
And maybe some other things.
and maybe some other things. We'll see where it goes. Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
So I think you were mentioning earlier, because this kind of we decided to do this on Twitter because we had some tweets going back and forth, and I think you previously had a question about um, in capital consumption theory, if like a VAT, a value added tax, as Andrew Yang proposes, if that would be helpful for sort of turning the capital consumption cycle, for helping to get rid of the capital consumption imbalance that we see. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's a couple different ways you can do a value added tax, but I've been looking at a subtraction method value added tax, which essentially is sort of like a business profits
yeah,
kind of tax.
yeah,
And so you talked about how when as jobs get automated, that
yeah,
can exacerbate the cycle. And so a
right.
value added tax that would keep the tax the same, whether or not jobs were automated or done with human labor. I was
Yeah,
wondering if that could dampen the effect.
absolutely, absolutely. Right. So, for anybody watching, in case you haven't heard of capital consumption theory before, the basic idea is that, due to things such as productivity growth, as well as other dynamics, the economy gets into a situation where we basically have underconsumption, and you don't have enough consumption to match the productive capacity that you actually have. So the accumulated capital in society actually would allow you to produce much more, but because regular consumer workers do not have enough income, they're not actually able to buy that production, and so you get this situation which I call capital consumption imbalance. And so, Brian, I think you are right. The prescription of capital consumption theory here is actually very simple. Anything that helps out the bottom 50%, even the bottom 80%, and provides more income or even more benefits, which allows them to save incomes, um, will help with this dynamic. The really interesting thing is that I would say that even if you don't take, so it goes a little bit into monetary theory, and I would actually say that that because you're underutilizing your capacity, that you have all this capital which is owned by the capitalists, which is useful for production, and it's not being utilized. You actually don't even have to do, like, say, a wealth tax, and you don't actually have to take wealth away from the top. All you have to do is provide income to the bottom. So even if you did like a monetary UBI, and you just printed the money and handed out to everybody on an equal basis, a UBI, that would work. And it would actually fix everything in the economy, and you wouldn't actually need taxes in this situation um, to balance it. But on the other hand, if for instance, for political reasons, if Congress is reluctant to kind of reform the monetary system in this way, and they say, well, let's fund it by with the VAT. Whereas Andrew Yang, also had this put the VAT into his policy.
Mhm.
And if you do that, that's fine too. And that's helpful. In fact, it is helpful to some degree, because what you have right now is sort of excess idle capital at the top, which is frustrated. It's not able to be actually turned into real investment, and turned into productive capacity, because the productive capacity is not, it's not profitable. It's not profitable to build more capacity right now, because the consumers don't have enough income to buy the production of that capacity that you would build. So you end up with excess idle capital kind of stagnating and pulling at the top. And so, for instance, in the last few years, you see like corporations, and we're used to providing stimulus to them through through debt markets, through the Federal Reserve, printing money onto debt markets. Interest rates go down, so corporations have access to this cheap capital that they can borrow. But then they borrow the capital, and then they sit and they look around and they say, what can we do with all this money? And they say, we don't actually have anything good to do with it. Let's buy back our shares and give it back to the shareholders. So that as a result, the money, which theoretically, like in a healthy economy, would be used for investing into the real economy, it can't do that. Instead, it goes right back into the financial sector. It goes right back into the share prices of the companies themselves, and into the stock market generally.
Yeah. I guess just to be clear, I don't think
Yeah.
either of us is proposing a value-added tax just for the fun of it,
Yeah.
but as a funding mechanism for UBI.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would work. Yeah, theoretically, um, it's you could actually just print the money, but if you want to fund it, with that, that would be good. That would be good policy, and especially to the degree, um, VAT is, I remember from the days when Yang was running for president, and there was sort of like a lot of pushback from the left that I saw, where people were saying, "Well, that's a sales tax, and that's going to come from the consumer."
Mhm.
A lot of people, would argue that aspect, and I don't think they're completely right about that. The VAT, would tend to, across the entire value chain, like um, it would depend on the elasticity of the supply and demand. So if you imagine, if you and I, like, I'm a seller and you're a buyer, and then this VAT tax comes along. So what's going to happen is going to depend on how elastic I am and how elastic you are. So if I, for some reason, like business pressures or whatever, say I have funding needs or something, I really, really need to sell what I'm trying to sell, and you can like take it or leave it. You can buy it or you cannot buy it. What's going to happen is that I'm going to end up like bringing my price way down to
Right.
make sure that you buy it. On the
And
other
that,
hand,
that,
if it's switched and I can like, I can sell it or not sell it, I'm fine either way, and you really have to buy it. Then a different thing is going to happen where I'm going to be able to keep my price high. I'm going to be able to add the tax onto my current price, and you're still going to buy it because for whatever reason your demand is inelastic. So it would, across the whole economy, it would really be shared between buyers and sellers.
yeah.
Um,
And that's how we get deflation is when producers are so desperate to sell that they have to cut their prices in order to attract people to spend their money on their product.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Which, and it also has to do with like how we are dealing with the monetary supply. So prior to the 1930s and prior to FDR taking us off of the gold standard, we were on a hard money monetary framework. So in that situation, um, deflation was actually quite common. Like over long periods of time, it used to happen that there would always be deflation, because your economy is growing, but your money supply is not. So
Right.
the only way for that to happen is for prices to go down. for
Yes.
the money to be able to buy more and more because you're producing more, but the money in the economy is not increasing. So you end up with deflation. But eventually that actually, in the Great Depression, that actually becomes, so deflation is common from like from Civil War periods to 1940 for 80 or 90 years. But it really became a big problem during the Great Depression, and I would argue that that is because deflation is not the core problem itself. It's possible to have deflation that does not give you a Great Depression. But the core problem was actually capital consumption imbalance, the same way it is today. The core problem was that the income of the consumer worker was not keeping up, and that is what drove deflation at that time, which became kind of reinforcing and very persistent. Um, but in the current economy and the current era, we have the same problem, but because we have monetary policy and fiscal policy left over from using it to fix the Great Depression, and we're in a more sort of inflationary or a soft money framework now. I think it's relatively unlikely that we get deflation right now, but yet we're still having a problem. We're still having a problem.
Yeah.
um, because the Federal Reserve is putting all this money into the system to try to keep it up. But the problem is that it is being misdirected because when it goes into debt markets in the current era, it actually helps. It goes onto the capital side of that capital consumption divide. It goes to capitalists. It doesn't go to consumers. It goes to corporations borrowing money on the debt markets, and that just makes the capital consumption imbalance even worse rather than actually fixing it. So a VAT could potentially be a little bit helpful there, if you do it right, and especially if you kind of keep it off of the essential stuff and turn it and have more of like the luxury taxes. Or like the semi-luxury taxes, and if so if you manage to target it to the upper, to the capitalists, to the companies, and you're pulling money from them, that's helpful. That's a good thing.
Well, so one of the things about universal basic income that I like is that it's universal, that it applies to everyone equally, and which takes away the stigma, of anything like that. And so if you start targeting your value added tax and saying, well, this will be exempt, and then this we're going to charge extra, and that,
Yeah.
do you think you sort of you lose some of those benefits of a UBI and reintroduce? Um,
Right. As you're probably more of an expert on that stuff than I am. I would just say that if you want to keep it sort of more as a universal program, probably the most feasible way to do that would be by actually just printing the money. But I do want to welcome Zach to the show. Um, we're in 3 different time zones here, and we just threw this together like yesterday. And I know that he was probably sleeping in his bed in the middle of the night, when some of those messages were going through. So, welcome, Zach, to our show. We
I'd
just
like
got.
to say I was early and then I got off and
That's true.
then missed a big portion of this, it seems.
Oh no, not a big portion. We actually just got started really.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
yeah,
We were just
um,
talking about a value added tax and whether that would, be helpful for correcting the capital consumption imbalance. And my feeling is that it would help. Pretty much anything that helps out the consumer worker, the bottom, 50%, the bottom 80%, is going to be helpful.
Every tax is good. Every tax. Just put them all on. Yay.
yeah,
Yeah.
No, but that's kind of the point, is that a lot of taxes, whenever they hit anybody, they mostly hit the rich. Even if, like, a value added tax, people say it's regressive, but it's only regressive if you aren't taking into account what the correlating expenditure that's coming from it.
Mhm.
Um, and so most taxes do hit rich people harder. and we do need to be we need to have in the framework of James Medlock, we need to have more tax positivity in our society.
Yeah, that's true. And that conversation gets very confused because some people talk in absolute terms like dollar figures, and then some people talk about a percentage of income. So you a lot of times, I think Zach is right, and a lot of times, but a lot of times, what is happening is that the absolute figure that's coming from the wealthy is larger, but the percentage figure, like a percentage of their income, is actually smaller. So, like people can twist that both ways. They can say, um, you're pretty much going to say like whatever whatever your bias leads you to say,
Well,
because different
it's really
ways.
funny. Like when we talk about land value taxes, a lot of leftists like to say land value taxes are great. And it's really funny to me because if you come from a point where you're talking about compared to property taxes, like I love land value taxes because they're really, if you want to have an efficient society, you don't want to tax the property, you want to tax the land. But they're extremely regressive because guess who can build properties on their land? The rich people. And so a property tax is more progressive.
Hmm.
um and if you talk to somebody about a land value tax, there's somebody will say, hey, it's that really benefits the rich. And there's always a point where you can kind of argue whichever side you want to argue on
Right.
Hmm.
a lot of policies.
Yeah, that's a good
Let's
point.
not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so when it comes to UBI, I actually prefer a couple different funding sources. So part of it is printing new money, and then part of it is a value added tax to sort of address economic inequality and things like that. And then also putting a fee and dividend on pollution to address the tragedy of the commons. Um, and so between those three things, I think you could fund UBI in a way that if one of them starts to go up or down, then the other two can sort of balance it out,
Yeah,
and be much more stable than getting all your funding from one single source.
absolutely. So we promised to talk about Bitcoin and UBI. So to try to bring it back towards that topic, because I think all three of us have lots of things that we like to discuss. But we promised the viewers that it was Bitcoin and UBI. One of the interesting things that as I was so as I've written this paper. Well, I'm like three-quarters of the way through writing this article about the CCT perspective of hyperinflation. And one of the things I did at the very end of the article is I offered proposed solutions, like based on the capital consumption theory of how severe or hyperinflation works. Um, how can you, if we were to ever get into a situation like that, what would some of the things that that you could that you could do? And one of the things that I figured you can do is a value added tax or a sales tax. There are like there is a stage in the hyperinflation where what's happening is that instead of people spending money because they want things and it's things that they want, they're spending the money because they're worried about the money going down in value, and so that actually drives. There are some such as MMT, and I would even say Alex Hallett with CMT. There are some people who would point out that um, the only thing that matters is spending levels. And so the CCT view of hyperinflation explains how that links up, because the the fear of value devaluation does cause spending to rise, and so the spending does rise, um, which causes inflation, which causes it to kind of get worse and worse. So one of the things that you could do, um, if it were really severe, there's other things that are easier and better. But one of the things that you could do is actually put on a sales tax or a VAT. And if this is sort of in the later stage of hyperinflation, I would suggest then taking that money, turning around, and then giving it back to everybody as a UBI. So you would essentially it almost be like a tax where the point is to stop people from spending, because right now people are spending in this situation because they're afraid, they just want to get rid of their currency. They're just afraid of holding on to currency. So you want to tax that and kind of uh, disincentivize, encourage people not to do that. But at the same time, they're also dealing with a very, like they're struggling, and generally the economy is contracting, and so then you want to take the money and give it back to everybody. So it's like you can have the money, but if you spend it, then some of that is going to be um, diverted to the government, and that would also help a little bit to balance revenues.
Although wouldn't you see a spike in inflation before that value added tax goes into effect as people try and spend that money before the new tax? Because that's what happened
Yeah,
in Japan. Japan bumped their VAT up I don't know,
absolutely.
2014 or so.
Yeah,
And
that's one of those really important one of the really important things about that. Politically, I don't know how you prevent that. I mean, I know economically that to prevent that, hopefully it would essentially be a surprise. Like nobody knows about it, and then one day they send out the communications. Okay, guys, 10% tax on everything, but we're going to give it back to you as a UBI. But hopefully you'd actually want to kind of drop the nets and not let people get out. But that is a really important um, dynamic, especially in hyperinflation.
oh,
So, for example, in Germany, one of the things is that the capitalist elites, they are they're not silly, and they were watching and expecting and looking and figuring that the government finances were fairly bad after the war. So they're like they understand, they know that okay, the government is probably going to be coming and taxing my money, and so they front ran that. They got out before. What happened was they sold a lot of their like German wealth and hid it in Switzerland. So that actually worked to drive the inflation and the hyperinflation. People foreseeing that attacks may be coming and they don't want to be hit by it, so they take their wealth out of the German mark. Um, I think it was generally more popular at that time because of the deflationary hard money framework. It was more popular at that time to keep a certain amount of wealth just in money or just in like short-term bills, because that would appreciate instead of depreciate over time as it does now. And so they a lot of them, so they because of that dynamic that you're talking about, they rushed out of the currency, and that crashed the currency value, and that sort of definitely helped to get the process going.
but a
Yeah,
lot of that was done deliberately, right? After World War One and the Treaty of Paris or whatever that put these really high reparations on Germany.
Yeah,
Germany deliberately ran double-digit inflation for some years to kind of keep their economy going, and then didn't they do that on purpose in 1923 and just crank up the presses and say
that's
heck
a
with it?
that's a bit hard to say. Well, it's a bit hard to say. Like we can't like kind of open up the brains of the German politicians at the time and say,
No,
"Aha,
but
this is what you are thinking." But
but John
yeah,
Maynard Keynes, right? He was there at the treaty at the in Paris or wherever
yeah,
for the treaty, and he recognized, he wrote the economic consequences of the peace and
yeah.
predicted that if we adopted this treaty that it was going to be
It's
open up Germany
yes,
for potential strongman to come in and promise to put their
yeah.
economy right.
Yeah, Keynes absolutely foresaw that the level of reparations that were being thrown around were going to be, really bad. Like it would not work for the German economy. That if you demand, high level of reparations in gold to the German economy, at that time he did warn that would create problems, and Germany was already running the printing presses in World War One, which was common at the time. So at the time, all the great powers, Britain, England, everybody got off the gold standard during the war. That was sort of just standard. That was sort of just standard. But after the war ended, um, Germany was the one where you eventually got hyperinflation. The other ones didn't. The other countries did not.
Well, no,
And
but
inflation,
they got deflation. Like when
they
England tried to go back on the gold standard, they wrecked their economy.
right,
And they
absolutely,
put everybody out of work so nobody had
yeah.
any money, and then that brought prices down,
Yeah.
so that people would buy them.
This is one of the really interesting things about this period of time and the hyperinflation. And again, like in my article, I wrote about this. Um, the period of time is really one of capital consumption imbalance, like we have now. It's a time of underconsumption. It's basically a time where economies are generally not really doing very well, and that's one of the sort of the obstacles, one of the traps. So England was thinking that like a strong currency. They figured it was a good thing. They figured it was like a sign of like faith, like people would have faith in the British currency. And
Plus they were like the world's economic power, right? They needed the Bank of
yeah,
London to be strong and people to have a lot of
right,
confidence in them. So they
absolutely,
wanted to get back on
absolutely.
that gold standard.
Right. But in fact, strengthening the currency was very bad for their economy. They had very high unemployment. And conversely, in the early times, in the first few years, like 1919, 20, 21, there were long periods of time where Germany was doing way better than everybody else in terms of unemployment. Like they had very low unemployment because the foreign exchange value was crashing. The German mark was getting really, really cheap.
Right.
And so their exports were doing really well. And people would, come into Germany as tourists and they would buy things. Um, I think one of the German officials said, the English and the Americans will find that, although they like will find that, although they've disliked Germans after the war, but now that when they find that they can come to Germany and buy things really cheap, like they will start liking Germans again. Like so, it's just a sort of a bit of a, maybe half humorously.
Yeah.
But absolutely, that happened, that the foreign exchange value goes down, and that is stimulative to the economy. That allows spending to go way up. But the problem becomes eventually that again, it's spending which is driven by um, a fear of the currency and not actual needs. So if you have to ask why did the foreign exchange crash, and one of the reason the foreign exchange crashes is because people who are holders of German marks, they're afraid of holding onto that German mark, so they sell it into the foreign exchange market. They want to buy Swiss francs or other currencies. So the German mark goes way down, and what is actually happening is that um, the that then the foreigners have access to these marks which are really cheap, so then they take the cheap marks and then they go and spend. So it's a two-step process, but ultimately it's a process that is driven by fear of holding the currency, and it results in spending. And that spending may look like may actually look kind of good for a while, but it is a very unstable type of spending because it will tend to overwhelm the capacity in the society. And then you do get inflation, and that comes back around to self-reinforce and cause the process to get stronger and stronger. So you get more inflation because of that strong spending, which causes more people to not want to hold their marks, which causes more inflation, and so it eventually gets into a cycle that ends up destroying the currency in the end.
So what do you see as I guess I want to say outside political influence as playing a role in hyperinflation? Like we talked about the treaty at the end of World War One affecting
Yeah,
Germany, and then in Zimbabwe, being
yeah,
cut off from the international credit market. The
right.
United States did that in December of 2007,
Yeah.
and Zimbabwe couldn't do anything.
So it plays into it, but So I'll speak more to the economic side than the political side. So I'm not an expert on why the politics happen, but when the result of the politics is, for example, that reparations are high, then what are the economics of that? And there's one thing for Germany that I want to point out, which is that news of very high reparations, drives the drives that spiral to get very bad. Um, but it is actually a narrative effect. It is the effect that all the elites, when they receive the news, because they were hoping that the reparations would be a little bit easier, a little bit less, a little bit more spread out over time. When they
Sorry,
get the news that
sorry,
it's going to be
who's
very
the
high,
elites that you're referring to? Who's the elites that you're referring to that want that to be
capitalists.
lower?
I'm just referring to people who have money,
Okay,
capitalists.
okay.
So when the capitalists get the news and they say, "Oh, okay, the reparations are going to be very high," they're like Keynes. They're looking at the government finances and they're saying, this is not going to work. The government is just going to have to print lots and lots of money, and so they're saying, "Okay, we better get all of our money out of the German mark." Maybe they were holding off a little bit, hoping for better news, but when the news hits, and 100% certainty, this is going to be really bad in terms of reparations are going to be bad, so printing is going to be bad, and then they rush out of the German mark. That crashes the exchange value, and that causes unstable, um, flight-driven spending, which causes more inflation, and so that when the reparations turn out to be that they're going to be very hard, then that's like the final kind of death throes of the currency occur after that. But on the other hand, when you go back in retrospect and look at what happened, um, Germany never got around to actually paying very much of those reparations because their economy was wrecked. So they tried really hard for like a few months, and then they were having this huge crisis. So
Right.
if you look at how much they paid over that period of time, they actually did not pay that much. So how is it possible that they were ruined by reparations that they did not even really pay very much of? And the answer is that it is not, well, it's not exact directly the reparations. It is actually the market participants, for projecting the results of the reparations being, lots of printing and rushing out of the currency. It's the rush out of the currency which causes the crash. Um, and in that, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think what you're saying is what I really liked about what you're saying is that you drew a distinction of loss of faith in the currency itself. That's kind of the triggering point for hyperinflation. It's not necessarily having to print more money, it's not printing more money, it's not
Yeah,
people having more money, it's not people spending more money. It's people
absolutely.
divesting from the currency because they don't believe it anymore.
Absolutely. And this is such a huge thing right now. So right now, if you follow the modern monetary theorists, and they're going to be saying, deficits don't matter, is what they're saying. Um, um, there is an aspect in which that is true. There's an aspect where it's definitely true that we could have more spending in the economy. Um, the problem comes about, um, and so I want to draw a distinction here. You have to look separately at the economy, which is one thing, and the economy desperately needs more spending. And then you have government finances on the other side, and the government finances are tied up to currency because the government has that option to print, and they do that when they get into the crunch. And as you said, it even is not necessarily, it is as it begins, as the government prints, in the beginning it's not a problem, and it's not a direct causation where printing is definitely going to cause hyperinflation. But what it does is it, um, it causes, it gives,
It gives
it
people like us a little bit of pause where we're like, whoa, the government can't spend that much, right? We're worried. What do we do?
Right, exactly. So it's a nuanced situation. So when I look at this situation, this brings to me what Soros calls reflexivity, where if you think about like an object in space, the object in space is not going to change its trajectory based on what people believe about that object. But when you're talking about economics and you're talking about people who, and each person is thinking something and they're doing deciding on economic actions because of their thoughts and their narratives, then the narrative actually becomes part of the actual situation. And so if the people are so, like, the most you know surefire way to make sure that nothing happens to your currency is if you build like a sound, this is what I would recommend. If you build a sound government finances, a sound budget, and you actually like balance or almost balance your budget, and keep the government finances really strong, then you will absolutely never have hyperinflation, because the government will have so much leeway that if they need to spend some money, they can borrow. And then if that has, if then they get into more trouble, then they can print. So it's sort of like you could say that, oh, you don't have to budget your balance, you don't have to balance your budget. You can borrow from the bank. So the bank's going to give you like credit lines, credit cards, whatever. So maybe you can borrow $50,000. But the problem is that you borrow the $50,000, and that's fine, that works. But then when you get to the end of the $50,000, if you have gotten used to spending more than you're bringing in as income, then when you get to the end of that, then you have a problem. Like either you have to cut down your spending, or and you have to start maybe paying back, or rolling it. But the the options are really helpful as guarantees. The option of borrowing and printing, they're really helpful as guarantees. But once you use them, then they are no longer an option. And so it's really when you get to the end of that chain that the narrative has any potential strength. So it's only when you get to the end of the chain, and you've borrowed so much that lenders don't want to lend anymore, and then you've printed so much that people are starting to get out of the currency. At that time, you do get into a dangerous situation, because suddenly you have to fix it really fast, or you go off the edge of the cliff.
But lenders almost always want to lend more, right? So it's these cases like Zimbabwe and Germany where these countries got cut off
Right.
from the international markets. That I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
is there an example of a time
Yeah.
that hyperinflation has occurred without outside influence, political influence, or where I don't know. I don't think it can happen accidentally. You got to be pretty determined to destroy confidence in your currency, don't you?
I don't think that you have to be determined to destroy the currency necessarily. Like, I think that one thing can lead to another, and you can go down. Um, One thing can lead to another, and it can be difficult to stop.
Are there any
So
examples of hyperinflation occurring accidentally?
no, well, I don't think. So to answer two of your questions just then, uh, shoot, I forgot what the question was.
Um, yeah. Can
Oh,
hyperinflation happen accidentally, or
oh,
doesn't it take
lenders,
deliberate?
lenders.
Okay.
So lenders want to lend. So in what case do you lose the lending? And so in Germany, they through the period of the war, they lost that ability. And so what I mean is that Germany was selling war bonds to fund the war, and in the very beginning, the public was happy to buy those bonds. So the public was lending to the government through the war bonds to fund the war. But as you go on through the war, and at some points the war is actually also not looking so good, that subscription goes down, 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 until at the very end, the public is not willing to buy any war bonds. And so the government has to print the money to buy the bonds instead. So you've lost and there's also inflation during the war, which is fairly common.
Right.
It was true of Britain and true of America also.
Yeah.
Um,
It happened in America with the Civil War as well.
so the lenders, in a nutshell, they're not willing to lend if they're worried that they're not going to get their money back. And so Zimbabwe, it was a similar thing. They were running deficits, and it can be a little bit it's a situation that can be hard to say, because sometimes, if you look at like the way a Ponzi scheme works, if you're willing to lend, like that can continue running like really a really long time. Sometimes you could be surprised like how far you can get if you just keep borrowing and the lenders keep lending. But at some point they do get
I
worried.
live in a country with $27 trillion in for the national debt.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we haven't run into a problem yet. Some people are getting worried, but and that's another part of the dynamic. It is a little bit self-reinforcing. It's a little bit like a bank run, where a normal bank will be running on a reserve, system, where they only have, like, say, 10% or 5% of the funds actually in their hands. Most of it is a promise, which normally that's not a problem, because when you ask for your money from the bank, somebody else is putting more money into the bank, so normally it works just fine. But when you have a crisis and everybody says, I want to get my money out of the bank, and they're all saying it at the same time, then people wanting money out of the bank causes the bank not to be able to give the money back. And it's similar with your government loans. So, if the World Bank had said, "Oh no, Zimbabwe, that guy, he's, Robert Mugabe, he's got good finances, he'll be fine," and they just kept lending, you are correct to say that that situation would be able to continue like a really long time. But it just, it gets, so it's a thing where it gets like, the finances kind of get like weaker and weaker and weaker, but at some point somebody says, I'm not really sure this is, sustainable. I'm not sure in the end we're definitely going to get our money back. I'm not going to lend today, or I want my money back, or I'm not going to extend you the next loan. And as soon as you don't extend the next loan, then it does indeed become a problem, and the whole thing just kind of falls over, if that makes sense. It's like, if your credit cards, you can kind of keep them rolling, but if there's ever a hiccup and one of the credit card companies says, we're decreasing your budget by this amount, suddenly it all kind of it all gets squeezed. It all sort of crashes down.
So what I want to say here is you recommended balanced budgets in order to, or a form of balance, not necessarily total balanced budgets, to keep faith.
Yeah.
But from what I'm understanding, faith is the most important thing. It's not the balanced budgets that
Right.
are the most important thing. The most important thing is faith.
Right.
And I would say, isn't there a lot of other ways to keep, and that's,
Yeah.
one of the biggest things I have learned is that the economy is run on stability and faith that
Right.
everything will be the same tomorrow
Absolutely.
or
And it's a little
relatively.
bit like, it's almost like a little bit of a house of cards. It seems a little bit like illusionary, and it's like amazing that it just keeps going.
Yeah.
It's absolutely dependent on faith, and a severe loss of faith will cause a huge problem in a modern economy, no matter how that loss of faith comes about. Um,
And and government printing money,
yeah,
it doesn't actually cause a problem in the econ. If it goes to the wrong people and it causes problems, like it can cause problems, but if it goes to the right people, it doesn't have to create inflation. It doesn't actually, it can actually make the system
right.
work better,
So
which is
there's
so
yeah,
weird
yeah,
because some people, like a lot of people in American thinking, think that when the government prints money that we
yeah.
should have less faith in the government, when it's not necessarily that way.
So
So there's two things
we
I
need
want
to
to say here
redefine.
before I forget. Brian, let me just say this, because otherwise I'll forget what I wanted to say. So the first thing is that it's dependent on faith, but on the other hand, faith is also dependent on facts. So, and especially when there's a certain degree of transparency and everybody can see, Maybe if the government were a black box and nobody knew that the money government was printing money, it would actually not as easily cause a problem. Just theoretically. But the point is that when people see that the finances don't match when they project it into the future, like what is the results? My point is just that faith depends on facts. And so if you get the facts to suggest that if you actually get your finances really strong, then people will have faith in you. If your finances become weak, then people may continue to have faith in you. But if they do not have faith in you or they lose faith at some point, then you have a big problem. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that again, we have to. The important thing, and that to do here is to separate the economy and the government. Those are two different things. And you're absolutely right that, for example, like Austrians, say something that I'm absolutely positive that everyone on the Austrian side would say, no, 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 do not print money for UBI. That's terrible. They all think that's a terrible idea. I think it is a wonderful idea. I think it's the right idea. I think the Austrians are right a lot about certain things like the dynamics of the hyperinflation, but they are completely wrong here. And the reason they're wrong is that they're not making that separation of the economy and the government. So I agree that the government finances should be sound, but I also agree, on the other hand, basically with the MMTers, the modern monetary theorists, that the economy is underfunded. So you actually need to put money into the economy. If you do that, the economy runs really well, and that will help your government finances. You're going to get more tax revenues into your government. You're not going to have this pressure. Part of the entire problem is that the government and the Federal Reserve has pressure to stimulate the economy, but it's being misdirected. So you have all this stimulus, which brings up the government debt, and it's a little bit misdirected. So I'm not a political, because it's going to the top instead of the bottom. But if you send it to the bottom instead, the economy would grow, and that would actually fix your government um, your government finances, which I think you should do, because that would actually be safer. I think we're not guaranteed to it's a lot of Austrians will think that because of all the money supply that we're definitely going to go into inflation. I don't think it's guaranteed by any means, but I do think that there is a significant risk building, and if we don't fix the trajectory, such as through UBI, that is definitely one of the paths that we may end up going down. For instance, if we don't get UBI, and if the current economic framework like continues to just send money into the debt markets, if the government stimulus that we get, one of the bad things about the PPP is that it all went to the big corporations. It didn't go to the small businesses. It went to the big corporations, and it did not, and it did not require the big corporations to, like, say, hire more people or anything. So you're just dumping even more capital into the top of the economy, which is already inflationary. It doesn't need it. So it's a situation where you need to fix the bottom, but the system is like fixing the top instead, which is actually like making the top go completely, like, get completely out of whack. And you get things like GameStop, stock market prices going way up as the economy does not go way up.
Well, that's like
Bitcoin,
I
sort
love
of
I love
pivots.
how Crystal Ball put it was we're not fixing the problem with renters not having money. Renters don't pay landlords, and then landlords are being called to bail out um, to get
Yeah,
bailed out because if the landlords go bankrupt, there's a big problem. And it is actually a huge
right,
problem if a bunch of landlords go bankrupt. But
absolutely.
you're kind of missing the core aspect of the problem, which is that the renters can't pay their rent.
Yeah,
But when politically, when we're solving these problems, we're thinking we don't solve the problem when it's at the core level, when it's not somebody who has a somebody lobbying for the government.
yeah,
We're solving the problem when it's become a huge problem that we can't solve. Yeah.
yeah. We're solving every single problem except the original root problem. We're solving all of the, all of the kind of down the road effects, and we're waiting till a bank or a landlord needs to be bailed out, and then like, fixing that for a, temporarily.
So Eddie, I might disagree with you slightly on when you say that
Yeah.
faith is based on facts. I think
Yeah.
it's influenced by it, but I think faith by definition is sort of exists independently from facts.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and so
yeah.
the solution I think is to redefine our faith in the currency and say, look, America's had a great year that we need an extra $2 trillion in circulation just to make the economy going. Good job, Americans. Here's your share. And if we can redefine faith that way and say, running a budget deficit, spending more money than we're taking in, and say, look, this is because of prosperity, and redefine it in faith that way,
Yeah.
um, I think that would help
I'm I'm
allay
happy
some
with
of the
the
fears.
framing.
And then
I don't have a problem with the framing. I do think that the people who are like sort of on the Austrian side of things are not going to be convinced. And some of the people that have a lot of, say, US dollar wealth, monetary wealth, like I don't think Warren Buffett and Ray Dalio, I don't think they're going to be like going to change their minds very much. They're either going to think that they're worried about the value of the dollar, or they're not, regardless of how you you know how you try to spin it to them. but
well,
I don't have a problem with that framing. I mean, and it's there's a level at which it is true. Again, it is, um, again, back to reflexivity. The faith and the narrative and the actions that result from that faith and that narrative, are very real. They have very real effects. Um, you know, China actually does this. Like, I noticed in the 2008, during the global financial crisis, and you turn on the TV, just when things are kind of sort of bad, and the TV in China is always going to tell you, like, China is strong, the economy is strong. Don't worry, as long as we're, kind of like FDR's. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. If everybody keeps the faith, we'll be okay. And there's there's I would absolutely think that that actually has some degree of real effect, to the degree that you're able to actually convince people that things are okay. That is helpful for preventing, like, a crashing economy, or a bank run, or something
yeah.
like that.
And so
um
so that goes back to what you're sort of talking about, the people who are I guess fear mongering about inflation and hyperinflation. And it
yeah.
makes it harder to convince people that things are okay when there's people out
Well,
there yelling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling.
yeah. Well, I wouldn't go too hard on them. Like, on the other side of the coin, when you see something that looks like it's going to be bad in the future, then it's also a natural instinct to say, that's going to be bad. We need to do something about it.
Okay,
Um,
but a lot of
but
us
but
thought
again,
that back in 2008, 2009, with all those trillions of dollars being printed. We're like, oh wow, big inflation is coming, and then it
yeah,
didn't. And
yeah,
so it forced
and
us
then
to
we're wrong
kind of
about that.
recheck our assumptions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, um, again, to be clear, there are some things that I think the Austrian story is right about, but there are some things which they're very wrong about. And especially the thing that they're most wrong about is that most of them would probably, um, disagree with monetary UBI. And the problem with their thinking is that they're not, there's something that they're not distinguishing there.
I love how you put it, where you're saying you need to separate the government finances from the economy. They're
Yeah,
two completely separate things.
yeah,
And if we keep thinking that government finances equals economy, you're wrong. It's just wrong.
yeah. And that it's the same mistake that the MMTers make, that the Austrians also make. So the MMTers say, because they're thinking of it as the same thing, we need more. They just say, we need more deficits, we need more. The Austrians say, no, 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 no. And they also think it's the same thing. And they say, we need less. You need to spend less, you need to borrow less. The MMTers are saying, when you need to spend more, you need to borrow more. I'm saying that the correct view, which synthesizes the whole picture and separates those two things, is that the economy needs more spending. And at the same time, it is actually a good thing to get the government budgets more like in order. And those two things are a little bit connected because right now with from as a whole as a continuation of Keynesian economics, like everybody thinks that when the economy is bad, you have the government borrow money. And that worked for the Great Depression, but when you bring it to the current era and you're doing it more and more, you've reached the end of the effectiveness, and you're getting to a point where it's a little bit bad for the government finances, and it's also not effective for the economy because it's not being directed, it's not going to UBI, it's not going to the bottom of the economy. I'm not an expert on these government things, but I will just say that I don't know how efficient government spending is. And if the government spending, if large portions of it, for instance, like with PPP, are actually going to the top of the economy, or like with bailouts, if all that money is going to the corporations, the capitalists, well, then you're making the problem worse and you're ruining government finance at the same time. So in conclusion, what you need to do again is that separation. The economy does need money. It needs money at the bottom, not the top. And the government finances would definitely be worth sort of making it more sustainable. Um, but that is definitely like less important than getting money to the bottom of the economy. If you don't get money to the bottom of the economy, if you do what the Austrians want and you start and you like cut off the spending and stuff, you're just going to have the economy crash. And when the economy crashes, that's not going to be good for your finances either, because your tax revenues are going to go way down.
Well, but then the Austrians will say we couldn't have had it anywhere different if this was the only thing that could have happened.
Yeah, they're wrong
Sorry,
about that. They're
sorry,
wrong.
I can't.
That's sort of what happened during the Great Depression in FDR, is that he started off with being willing to spend money and run deficits. But around
Yeah,
1937, 1938, he lost faith, and he went back to balancing the budget, and caused another recession
right,
back then. But
right.
the other thing I was gonna say is, you talked about deflation in American history at the end of the 19th century. And so the Democrats nominated this guy named William Jennings Bryan to run for president in
Yeah,
1896. And one of his big issues was free silver, to increase
yeah,
the money supply that way. And so
yeah.
he's got a great quote. He said, if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up through every class which rests upon them. And that's
Absolutely.
what we need to do today. That's sort of
That's right.
the precursor of a trickle up economy.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's absolutely right. One of the things is that in that era, with the deflationary money and the money that gets stronger and stronger in value over time. One of the things that is that in that era, um, it would have been more like capitalists, people with money would be more willing to save their wealth in money and less willing to go into debt. And so in that era, the people that were in debt that William Jennings Bryan was talking to were all these like small, farmers, um, that were getting into debt because their business model was getting run over by productivity growth in
Right.
agriculture. And then when they got into a really bad problem, then they had no other choice but to go to the bank and say, "Oh, sorry, I need a loan." And then deflation would crush them more because their loan value would get larger and larger in real terms. um, so William Jennings Bryan in the silver movement in a way that is actually analogous to UBI today. So during that time when you were in a hard money thing and that was being hard on your bottom half of your economy, um, that is a correct solution. That's a good solution. Like soften the money so that the debtors at the bottom, like give them a break. That's going to be good, and that works. But now that we're in 2000, it no longer works because again now all the debt's at the top. Like the people at the top figured out, whoa, debt is really helpful. When the currency is depreciating in value. So now everybody at the top, all the companies, everything, they know to use lots and lots of debt. Um, and the system has not adapted yet. And so where it started off helping out the bottom, now the same action is helping out the top. And now what you actually need is monetary UBI, and you could actually like sort of cut off a little bit of that traditional monetary policy. You can actually let the interest rate rise a little bit as you're giving, monetary UBI to the bottom,
Right.
because there's too much at the top, and it's no good because the capitalists, um, they're not incentivized to build production when the bottom doesn't have money to buy it. So instead they just you end up with like these unstable bubble games. It's all about like, if Elon Musk tweets about Dogecoin, well, a bunch of people like jump into Dogecoin, then he's going to make lots of money as the price goes up. um, yeah, it's an unstable bubble game due to excess stagnant capital at the top that has nowhere to go.
Yeah, we've talked about what government could do to try and stabilize these cycles, but I think at the end of the day, what we want government to do is to make sure the people are taken care of.
Yeah,
Make sure
absolutely.
that, the people of the country are prosperous, and
Yeah.
UBI is the easiest, simplest way to establish an
Yeah,
economic floor.
absolutely. And it's such an incredible thing. At one of the BBI podcasts, I pointed out that, um, if you were to take, right now we have like $60,000 GDP per capita. That's how much we produce. That's how wealthy we are currently. And if you imagine that, like in 200 years, um, that increases by 100-fold. So in 200 years later, like we're producing $6 million per capita. That's our production in 200 years. And you ask the question, 200 years from now, are we still going to have poverty? And I think everybody would be really surprised if you said yes. They'd be like, how? No way, $6 million per person? Like, no way you can have poverty when you have $6 million per person in production. Everybody's going to be rich. But then if you go back 200 years ago, GDP was 100 times less than it was today. It was $600 a year at that time. And people managed to survive. It was mostly just feeding themselves and having clothes. But they managed to survive. But if you asked them at the time, and they had poverty at the time, but if you said 200 years from now, there's going to be $60,000 per person worth of production, are there going to be poor people? And they would be like, no, you're crazy. $60,000 per year, that is a fortune. Obviously, everybody's going to be rich. And it's this enormous, like, this is really absurd that we still have poverty and everybody's like used to it, so they think that that is sort of normal. They just assume that that's normal because that's how it's always been. But when you think about it, that makes no sense. We're producing 100 times more production than we were 100 years ago, and people survived then. How do we not have a population that is, everybody is at least like able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and house themselves with absolutely no, like, it should just not be an issue in our current economy.
So Keynes looked at this back in 1930. He wrote a short article. I forget the exact title, something about the opportunities for our grandchildren. And he
Yeah.
predicted by 2030 that we could have 15-hour work weeks, because
Yep.
just enough to make us feel like we were doing something, keeping us doing some manual labor and keeping us from just being couch potatoes. But
Yeah.
that just increases in productivity would mean that was all that was necessary.
Yep.
The problem with that, though, is that without UBI as a way to establish that floor,
Yeah.
that 15-hour work week would depend on like a really high hourly wage, and then that skews the whole market. So,
And
yeah,
that's
I mean,
something that's
yeah.
Eddie's talked about before, is
Yeah.
the incentives that exist right now, instead of those productivity gains going into, like, partially into the labor force, it's all gone into the top. It's all gone into the CEOs and the shareholder class.
Yeah.
And um, uh, we need something to balance that out. And a lot of people, I love when they say UBI is a way to increase collective bargaining, because when you can say no, your wage goes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
um, although to be fair, there may be some cases where wages go down as a result of UBI because people don't They don't need as much. They've already got a basic income and they don't need as much.
Well, because then they want to work that job.
Right.
Then more people who don't have to work the job they hate, they can go and work in a job they actually like,
Right.
which is fine as long as we get somebody into the job who wants the money. That'd
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah.
I,
And
I
all
actually,
these things are always in flux anyway. These
yeah.
things are always changing. So let's change them in a way where we establish an economic floor for everyone and go ahead and eliminate poverty and then let things sort themselves out after that. But that ought to be our new framework.
Brian, my perspective is that for the most part, when you institute UBI, um, wages will generally just go way up. They'll just generally go way up because it will be a huge increase in aggregate demand. People will have money to spend. That increases demand, and when they spend the money, when they go to the restaurant, somebody has to serve them. When they go buy clothes, somebody has to make the clothes. That increase in demand causes an increase in labor demand. Like businesses will have to hire to be able to keep up with the activity, and that increase in labor demand will definitely drive higher wages. Another sort of like kind of like slow boiled frog, that idiom where the frog is like in the
Yes.
water and it slowly gets warmer and it just sits there until it's boiled because it's a gradual change. Um, is that I think most people do not realize that wages are just way too low, and they're way too low because productivity growth has been the dominant force from the 1970s and until now, and as a result that those wages are very low. So when you ask economists if labor demand is too low, most of them will point to unemployment, and unemployment prior to COVID was actually at record lows. And there's actually a very simple um, thing that they're not taking into account in the thinking, which is that if you think about it, demand, including labor demand, it is one thing that stretches across two variables. The two variables being quantity and price. So your quantity is your unemployment, um, and the price is the labor wages. And so economists look at unemployment. They're used to looking at it. And so when unemployment is at like 3%, prior to the COVID crisis, they say, oh, there's not a problem with labor demand. But I would argue that there is actually an enormous problem with labor demand because labor wages have been stagnant for 40 to 50 years while the economy has grown by like a factor of 5. Labor demand is way down. It's way lower than it should be relative um, to the economy, and that is seen by low labor wages that are stagnant and don't grow, rather than in unemployment.
Are you
So
talking about the low labor force participation rate?
no,
Um,
not even the low labor
oh,
force participation rate. So so to some degree, not even because low labor force participation that's still in that quantity axis. So even that is still just talking about how many people have jobs. I'm saying that the labor demand problem is not that people don't have jobs; it's that they do, they don't have good enough jobs.
They
They
have
don't
low
have jobs
wage
that pay
jobs.
them really well. So if you think about it, so if you increase labor demand by a great deal, so say like you put in UBI and spending goes up by like um, 20-30%. Capacity utilization would come back up. But there's a question here, like pre-COVID, we were at 3% unemployment. So if demand goes up by 30%, spending goes up by 30%, what happens? I mean, obviously, we cannot hire 30% more labor because at 3% unemployment, most of the labor is already being used. And so what actually happens is that demand and spending driving labor demand up will cause labor wages to be bid up. So people will find that it's really easy to get a job, and employers will find it's really hard to find people because there's 30% more activity and there's not 30% more people. That means that labor wages get bid up.
oh,
As labor wages get bid up, two things happen. One thing is that the jobs that don't pay very well, like people will move out of them. Like if people are working as a cashier for like, like $8 an hour, and then suddenly they can easily get a job that pays 20 or $30. Nobody's going to want to be a cashier. So what does McDonald's do after they can't find cashiers for $8 an hour? And if they want a cashier, they'll have to pay them $30 an hour because that is the market labor wage. What happens is that they look at their finances and they say, that would not like work with our model. And they say, but oh, you know what? Like technology, lately they've had these automated kiosks where we can just put a kiosk in and then people come to the kiosk and they are their own cashier. They just order their stuff, they pay with their Apple Pay or the credit card or whatever, and you don't need the cashier. You just get rid of the job because the job is a low quality job. It's not utilizing the human labor very well. And so you just get rid of the jobs that don't pay well, don't create a lot of value because you're creating 30% more of the higher paying jobs. And so the labor force actually gets sucked into jobs that are high value, high productivity. And I think, Zach, you and I have talked about a little bit how that productivity, like a lot of people think productivity has something to do with a person. And I would say it has almost nothing to do with the person. Most of productivity, most of the reason why we're so much more productive today than we were 200 years ago is not that, people 200 years ago were like lazy. Actually, they worked really, really hard. The reason is because we have this built up uh, capital supporting workers in the economy today. And so you can continue to build up more capital and automate away the the unnecessary jobs, the crap jobs, the low value jobs. Those Uber drivers in this situation where we've got really high demand, they can all be automated, and you can have AI that it works better than humans, doesn't crash as much, because the Uber drivers will be pulled into, like, they'll be looking around and the other jobs will be paying $30 an hour and they'll say, bye bye Uber, I'm not driving for you anymore. Then
So
Uber
what you're saying is, when you
like
increase labor, you're increasing the incentive to invest. It makes investments a better option. And
exactly, exactly,
like it solves a lot of our problems with things like stock buybacks because now companies have a reason to invest again
yeah,
because they can
absolutely,
save money on
absolutely.
labor, which is a good thing
Yeah,
as long
absolutely.
as we are harvesting some of the gains for everyone.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
absolutely.
so how
um,
much, so with UBI, if you see that as increasing labor costs, how much do you think that will drive inflation as a result of UBI?
um, so let me just take a note.
And so McDonald's, for example, right? If you have to pay double or triple the wages, and their labor costs are probably a quarter of their menu prices.
Yeah,
Um,
how much will that drive inflation? um, it won't drive inflation because, again, the capacity utilization is actually really low. Um, capacity utilization is at like 70%, where it can definitely get up to 90%. So, um,
well, so how
I would say that UBI is going to cause labor costs to go up,
yeah,
which if it can't be absorbed by larger amounts, like it can, we have to monitor this. This is the thing that I love that Alex Howlett says, is that we have to monitor this. We can't say that UBI doesn't cause inflation. We actually have to check to see if it does. And that's where Eddie's comes in, where how much of our capacity are we using? If we can increase capacity and those labor costs are eaten up by increases in selling units, then there is no inflation. But that's going to be different for every single industry. That's going to be different for all these things. We do need to monitor this,
yeah,
but we don't need to say we can't do this because inflation. That
no,
that's way too simplistic of a,
poverty is a much bigger problem than inflation.
well,
so,
but it's
so to try
still,
to,
Fix
yeah.
poverty.
yeah. So to try to wrap our minds around this and to really understand like how it works, and to kind of get our models working so that we understand what would happen. Um, let, let's think about this. So um, it certainly, makes, where should I start here? So it certainly makes some sense that wages um, going up are a cost, um, but they definitely would not cause inflation to the degree of negating the benefit through the UBI and even through the labor income. Um, and the reason, again, is because of the potential for productivity growth. So what happens is that as labor demand goes up, it's going to pull up on on labor costs, on wages, labor wages. Um, at the same time as the wages go up, um, companies, the higher wages go, the more companies are incentivized to actually do that real investment into productivity growth, to buy those kiosks and to hire the engineers to get it all working, to automate away the jobs. So, so productivity growth, a lot of economists like normally will say, oh, productivity growth like allows wages to go up because you're producing more, and that is actually sort of hand wavy. You could imagine that happening,
It
but
says that very specifically in economics in one lesson. This is how you
yeah,
get wage increases, is productivity. It all get
right,
passed
they
on to the
say that.
workers, really.
Right. But it's a little hand wavy. I mean, you can see how that would be like sort of a precondition. Like the productivity growth has to go up, enable for real wages to rise. It is a precondition, but it does not actually cause it to happen. That's not a mechanism. And the mechanism, in fact, goes in the opposite direction. Because if your productivity growth goes up and you can produce more with less labor, that's driving labor demand down. And the result of the direct result of productivity growth is that the labor wages go down, down, down. So what happens, and what we want to do is that we put in this UBI, we push demand up, and that pushes labor demand back up. And now you have some people saying, no, 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 you'll get inflation. Well, it will not. You will not get inflation because that is what productivity growth is for. The productivity growth um, substitutes away some of that labor. It substitutes capital in the place of labor. And so, in the case that we did not have UBI, the capital taking away the jobs was absolutely causing wages to go down, labor income to go down. But now that we put UBI in and drive the demand up, it does the same thing, which is now a good thing. So the demand is causing the wages to go up, up, up. But the productivity growth, now it's driving the productivity growth so that the companies have to invest in more productivity growth in order to keep the wages from rising too fast. Does that, if that makes sense? That's the whole model. So you end up, so instead of inflation, you will actually get productivity growth when you get your labor wages to actually rise.
I
And
think what you say
another
makes
thing,
sense in theory. I think that we can see inflation in certain industries in a certain time, depending on how high the UBI drives labor demand and how much they can compensate with productivity growth in a certain amount of time, right?
right?
And
Um,
and this can
so
even work in the other direction from some industries where their products are digital, right? Like if everybody wants to buy, has extra spending money, Netflix
yeah,
isn't going to have to hire more people to deliver those
yeah,
subscriptions. They
yeah,
can just make, free
they'll have
copies.
big productivity gains,
Yeah.
absolutely. So instead of just only staying at the theoretical level, um, we should look back in history and look to the last time that we managed to get aggregate demand and labor incomes to go up, and that was coming out of the Great Depression. So coming out of the Great Depression after the New Deal and all the reforms, spending goes up, labor income goes up. You have really great productivity growth. Like basically all economists agree that the economy after coming out of the Great Depression was really good. um, you had productivity growth. You actually did have some inflation, but it went up to maybe like 5%, and then it came down for a long time, and then it was not a problem until you got to the 60s and 70s when you're hitting capacity constraints. Um, so yes, there was a little bit of inflation, but there was far more real growth. So maybe prices went up a bit, but incomes are going up even much faster, and so you do get real growth. And there is a little bit of inflation, but not very much. Post Great Depression, I think at one point it spiked up to like 5% and then came back down again. And that's what I think would happen if we instituted UBI at a level of say like $1,000 a month, which would be appropriate. And another part of that is that there's a
And they
spending.
wanted inflation though. We should say that they actually wanted inflation in the Great Depression to start bringing stabilized prices, especially for farmers who were the
Oh, yeah,
ones who've been hurt so much by falling crop prices. They wanted
yeah,
inflation that would save those farmers from going bankrupt and losing their
yeah.
farms and making things
They,
worse.
they wanted some, but they didn't want too much. I mean, they did have experience, like they had wartime inflation, so they knew that inflation can get bad and it can be, it can be harmful. But even it's yeah, it's some people today, some economists today say, oh, you need inflation, like Ray Dalio, who's a hedge fund manager, not an economist. Uh, will point out that you sort of like need inflation to eat away at the huge debt pile that you have. That you need, you need to like kind of get rid of the debt pile, and I think I used to buy that, but I now actually think that is actually um, the wrong perspective. That you don't. I mean, inflation it can it can sort of rejigger things a little bit by helping the debtors and kind of taxing away some of the savers' money.
That
like
can be a
like you
perk.
say, you
But
gotta separate the
but
government
right,
and the economy.
exactly. But what you really want is the real growth. What you really want is the economy to actually grow, and that actually fixes things because if you grow the economy faster than the debt, then you come out of it. I actually have a perspective that is a little bit wonky, but I'll go ahead and spit it out and see what you guys think. If you can follow what I'm trying to say, which is that the big debt cycle, which Ray Dalio follows, and I believe like Steve Keen is also a big, talks about debt a lot. Um, I think Ray Dalio has actually missed the reason that the debt cycle happens. He's actually missed the reason that the debts pile up. So, if you think about the supply and demand of debt, like people supplying funds to be borrowed and people borrowing funds, demanding funds that they need to borrow. Um, and you see this debt, the quantity of debt being transacted going up and up and up. There's more and more debt, happening in the world. You could explain that in two ways based on supply and demand. One way you could explain it is that demand for debt is going way up. Like people like are just they really want to borrow money, and so all of that demand for debt is causing more and more debt to exist. The other way to explain it is that it's because of supply. More and more people are trying to lend their money out, and that is what's driving the quantity. So if you think about it, between those two hypotheses, they would have different effects theoretically on the price. So a demand-driven increase in quantity would cause the price to also go up. So if this was happening because debtors are like, oh, I want to borrow more, I want to borrow more, then you would expect that would cause the price of the debt to go up because so many people are demanding it. So the price is going to go up. Interest rates, which are the price of debt, would go up in that case. But that's not what we see. What you actually see is interest rates going down, down, down. And that is consistent with a situation where it is driven by supply. So, and leading back to capital consumption theory, because you have this enormous pool of excess idle capital, and people don't know where to put it. They put it into the stock markets, but then the prices go up and it's not a good deal anymore. All the assets are going up, and the price of debt is going down. That's consistent with it is a supply phenomenon. It's because of the excess idle capital trying to find somewhere to go that is actually what is drives down the interest rate. that is actually what drives the quantity up. So it's not the root of it. Again, is capital consumption imbalance. It is not a problem of debtors wanting to borrow more and more. It's actually the suppliers of debt, suppliers of money having nowhere productive to put their capital, and so they end up lending it out. And for example, it works into the consumer economy also, because companies will start to find, like, on the one hand, their cost of capital is really cheap. They have money really cheap. On the other hand, they're having trouble getting people to buy the things that they're selling. And then at some point they discover, whoa, if you take this capital here, give it to the customer as a loan and say, buy this, lawnmower for low monthly rate of $10 a month. We'll loan you the money and you can pay us back over time. That, like, works really well in this scenario, because cost of capital is low and demand is low, and you need to get demand going. So what you end up doing, and Jeff Crocker talks about this a lot, is that you end up boosting the demand up using debt to fund it. And then after you do that, then people start wondering, oh, there's worrying about the debt, saying there's too much debt. And they're wrong to worry about, well, how to say it. It's not like a lot of people will, like, moralize it and say, oh, like, households are like people, just, they don't know how to save their money anymore. They're just, it's all, they're borrowing money for the houses. They're borrowing, and they'll, like, moralize it as if the people who are borrowing money are doing something wrong, and it's because they're too immoral that we have this problem. And I would say that from a CCT perspective, capital consumption theory, the root is not with them. The root is actually with the capital consumption imbalance. Too much capital, too little demand. And one of the things that happens is that the capital actually reaches around to support the demand, which needs a lot of support, as by causing debt to go up. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. I have a slightly different
Yeah.
take on it,
Yeah.
which is so the reason that interest rates are so low, as I see it, is because we're trying to grow the money supply, and since the way that we do that is creating money through debt, bring those interest rates down to persuade people to take on more debt so we can grow the money supply.
Yeah.
And that's because we're doing money backwards. Congress, has the authority to create money directly, and instead of letting the banks do it, create it through debt and then paying hundreds of billions of dollars in interests, we should be creating that money directly and giving everyone an equal share. And that would be the proper way to increase the money supply, as opposed to offering low interest rates to try and spur people to borrow it.
The way I understand what you're saying, Eddie, is that Gordon Gekko said that greed is good, and he was wrong. It's not greed that's good, it's consumption that is good.
well, well put. Well put. And consumption, that also has, like, this sort of, like, some people, like, sort of moralize that and say that consumption is bad. But if you think about it, consumption, um, we're talking about people being able to have housing, have food, have clothing, especially when we're talking about the consumption, which is really direly in distress, which is the consumption at the bottom of the economy. It's not the people at the top, they have enough income. They do as much consumption as they need, but the people at the bottom, they're starving for consumption, meaning they don't have incomes and monies to buy, all of the things that they need, all of the problems that they have, which could be solved by money, but they don't have money to solve the problems with. That's what we're talking about, and it's absolutely a good thing. It's absolutely something that we should be trying to enable. Yeah. And
Well,
and there are economic reasons why that's happening, and it's not, and it's unnecessary. It's just simply because the current framework, like, it needs a revamp, and nobody realizes that it's not working anymore, and it's just it's creating problems instead of solving problems.
Well, I think a lot of people realize it's not working anymore. They just don't
Yeah.
know how to
They
get
don't
it to a
realize
place where
what's
it
wrong
doesn't.
with it. Yeah, they don't realize what's wrong with it. Yeah.
Right. Or they do. And if you're in America, you got the Republicans and the Democrats to choose from,
Yeah,
and how do you get one of them to fix the problem? Um,
yeah, yeah. I'm actually of the opinion that most people, including all these famous economists, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, I read very carefully what they write, and I'm convinced that they don't get it. They don't understand what's wrong with the economy. Um, yeah.
yeah,
They're generally, most economists are generally stuck on like a one-dimensional understanding of the economy, where they will dress it up with fancy terms, but at the very core their model is basically, like, to make it a simple analogy, it's that car. The economy is a car, and if it's going too slow, then you press the gas. But if you press the gas too hard, then you get inflation. And if you get inflation, then you want to press the brake to stop the inflation. But if you press the brake too hard, then you get unemployment. It's one dimensional. They think that is what's happening. And the thing that happens is that when you have this imbalance, um, both answers are wrong. Like, putting money into the top is wrong, and not putting money into the bottom is also wrong. They're both wrong, and you have to split apart that one dimension. And it's not just you know gas or brake. It's money into or out of the top, which is capital, or the bottom, which is the consumer worker. And that's why, like, that's why it's very most people are very confused. They're not sure if we're at risk for inflation, or some people think we're at risk for deflation, or you need to put more money in or less money in. Like, nothing seems to really make sense because they're all stuck on one dimension. The Austrians want us to stop borrowing and stop printing, but if we did that, if that's all we did, we would just have the economy just crash. Because you see that we've been doing enormous amounts of that, and the economy is just barely staying up. If we took it all away, it would just directly crash. And that's because you do need to put it in, but it would be much better to put it in at the bottom. That would work. We're putting enormous amounts on the top, and like a little bit, it gets down to the bottom, and that's not working.
I like your car analogy. So I guess just to build on it a little bit, I like to
Yeah,
think of the economy. We want to keep it in idle so that the car is just inching forward at a regular pace so you can
yeah,
control it. And
absolutely.
the people who want to put it in neutral, then you open yourself up to all sorts of problems. Maybe you start rolling backwards or you just don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But by keeping it in shooting for that 2%, I don't know what you think about what a target inflation rate should be, but 2% or whatever, to just keep your car moving forward a little bit at a time in idle.
I think we just should just shoot for keeping capacity utilization fairly high, above 85%. I think that is actually the the accurate measure. To extend the analogy further on the car and then go to another one, um, it's as if, like, if you look at from the 1970s until now, what happens is that every time you get a recession, the Fed brings interest rates down. We recover from the recession, and then they bring it up. But the interest rates never go up as high as they used to be. And so the long term trend is always like, down, 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 even though you always recover from the recession. And so it's almost as if we're pushing the gas when we get a recession, and then we recover. But then after we recover, the gas pedal never quite gets back up to where it used to be. So, it goes down and then back up, down and go back up. But it just keeps going farther and farther down. And you're now at the floor. And what you should be doing is taking a step back and saying, okay, what is going on here? Why do we keep having to bring interest rates lower and lower? Another analogy I use is that, it's like, capacity utilization. It's like the instrument panels on your airplane. If you're flying an airplane, it turns out you need to know what your airspeed is, which is actually not that easily, like, it's not obvious from looking out the window because it's just sky. And pilots, they absolutely have to know their airspeed to understand what's going on. If they lose that and they don't know what's going on, it's very easy for them to have a mistake. And the economy is like that in terms of, we're looking at the wrong things. We're looking at unemployment, but we should also consider wages. And we should also be looking at capacity utilization and long-term interest rates. Those are the things that will actually tell you where the economy is relative to where it could be, and keeping those, tight is what would actually keep all the negative effects away. But I think we're running up against time. So, if you
Before
guys have,
before I just wanted to say I love how you say capacity utilization, we should be targeting that, because I think targeting that actually targets inflation too. It has the byproduct of getting an inflation because of how um, they're connected. And if we target inflation, we have to like make all these other things
yeah,
work. But
yeah,
targeting capacity utilization results in a good interest rate. But yeah,
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Where does that
It's cool.
85% target come from? Is that like a historical average that you think works well?
So if you look at capacity utilization, it was in the 70s and dropped into the 60s in the Great Depression. It slowly comes up, and in the 70s you get up to you bump up against 90%, and as you're bumping up against 90%, you're also seeing capacity constraint inflation going up. And then when you get off of it, when you manage to get off of it, then inflation goes away almost right away. And so that is just, yeah, based on historically, based on hitting capacity constraints in the 70s, that suggests to me that probably the highest you can safely go without getting inflation is about 90%. If you get much higher, then you start getting inflationary pressures. But you really want to just, come gently off it, but then you have to go back up. And they didn't realize that you would get the paradox of the worker consumer. And after you come off the ceiling, you keep on going down until you hit the floor, which is where we're at. There's one thing that I wanted to say about what Zach just said, but I totally forgot what it was. So maybe in a future episode.
All right. Are we getting to time, or you guys wanted to wrap up and do final thoughts and things?
I'd
Yeah,
love
let's.
to. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do it.
I'll start since I was the last person to come here. Um, hey, I really like to talk. I always learn something from Eddie. Uh, look, UBI. I think we all agree UBI is great. Stop thinking that government spending equals inflation. That's my final thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you guys both for the invitation and the conversation. I know there's probably we could go on for hours and hours, so maybe we can do this again sometime. I did just want to talk a little bit about my project and the Phoenix Congress and the American Union.
Yeah,
And our goal is to see UBI enacted in 2022 by collectively bargaining as voters, as swing voters, and using that our votes as pressure to get Republicans and Democrats who are running for office to
yeah,
either get on board or get out of the way.
that's
And so the same way that I've said we're doing money backwards, but and we need to turn it around, we're doing politics backwards too, where we're electing people on the basis of promises that they don't keep, and we just keep doing that over and over again. So what the Phoenix Congress is doing is writing a legislative package that includes universal basic income to end poverty. It ends mass incarceration through police and prison reforms and ending the federal drug war, and then ends the endless wars by downsizing our military and um, making some other foreign policy adjustments. And so by putting this together in one legislative package and offering to reelect the incumbents who enact it before the election, we can leverage our votes in a way that if they want to keep their jobs, they need to be more responsive to we the people. So
absolutely.
if you're interested in more information, visit anamericanunion.com and sign up for our newsletter, and or you can make a donation to our super PAC if you want to help influence this. So
Thank you,
thank you guys
Brian.
again.
Thank you. Um, I, I remembered what I wanted to say, which is that it's absolutely the case, like that airplane analogy, that economists, they don't have a true north. Um, they generally tend to look at GDP growth, and they have found that, like, after the 70s, that like 3%, it tends to be what the economy does, and so they they just assume that they're kind of like, it's just like, it's really as simple as saying, oh, well, the economy's done 3% before, so we think that's what it can do. Um, but they don't have a fundamental theoretical reason. They don't understand why it grows at 3% and not faster. And if you look at, the period after the Great Depression, before the 70s, we actually got much, significantly higher growth. Um, and so the true north again that you need to be looking at is you really should be looking at productive capacity utilization. If you're keeping the factory busy, then that's the economy is busy. If it's empty, idle 20% of the time, then you're doing something wrong in the economy, and that is the true north, the measurement that you should be um, focusing on, instead of just saying, oh, it's done 3%, so it could probably, if we don't do 3%, then apparently it's wrong. And that's just not as helpful. But thank you guys very much for having this talk. I really enjoy these, and I'm really glad that you guys are willing to do these. So I hope to do this again very soon with both of you.
All right.
Thank you, Eddie. I always enjoy it.
Exactly. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank
Good
you,
to meet
Zach.
you, Brian.
You too.